Good morning. It's Nick with OYA Knowledge, and today's video I want to talk about the specialized units at MacLarem. And here's the reason why I want to talk about those units is because I want to verbally process and get out here kind of some raw thoughts about what those units are, how kids get on those units, what's their purpose, what's the programming like on those living units. And it's because I get asked this quite a bit, and I end up having to shoulder the responsibility for being the gatekeeper for those living units at MacLarem. And between even the people internally at MacLarem, definitely within the field offices and individual JPPOs and other facilities, there's just a lot of mystery and confusion around what are those units, how do kids get there, what's the placement criteria, what's the process. And sometimes it gets painted or it gets portrayed as me being the ultimate authority in decision maker around kids coming and going out of those living units. And I think there's some truth to that, because I just don't think that there's a solid understanding overall what the vision is for those living units. So I can own that part of it. I really don't want to be the only person that can map onto that vision, but I have honestly struggled to communicate it in a way that other people can grasp it. So this will be one effort, is putting this video out, and I kind of had a thought about getting some people together and helping me do a process map so that it can be shared in a way hopefully that other people can understand it better. Okay, so that's the reason why I'm doing this video. Specialized units at MacLarem. What are they? How do kids get there? What's the process? And what's the programming in those units? So I'm talking about the Oak unit, the Rockaway unit, and the Pacific unit. And this might be news to people that work on those units if you're watching this video, but you're all the same to me, honestly. Meaning, yeah, you may have some different types of kids across those three units, but ultimately your goal is the same across those three units. And we'll talk about the goal hopefully later in this video, but maybe in a different video. But part of the vision is I want those three units to operate very similarly, with the same understanding, with the similar approach to the kids that are placed on those living units. There shouldn't be a vast amount of difference between those three living units, and the culture and the mindset that the staff drive forward should be very similar between those three living units. So that's my vision, and we're getting there. Okay, all right. So let's talk about the past to a certain degree, at least the past in terms of how we've referenced or referred to those living units. So unfortunately, our shorthand communication about those three living units sounds something like this: MacLarem has 2 mental health units and a trauma unit. Not the case. We don't have 2 mental health units, and we don't have a trauma unit. But Nick, we have kids with mental health. Yep. Over 80% of our kids come into us with a major mental illness diagnosed prior to coming in. 80%. Roughly, 800 kids inside facilities. So what is that? 600 of them have a major mental illness. How many beds do I have in the courtyard for the specialized units? 16 times 3. Okay. So I've got less than 50 beds for 600 kids that carry a diagnosis consistent with a major mental illness. Okay? So I guess in some ways, if we're going to call those 3 units mental health units, or 2 mental health and a trauma unit, we ought to be calling all the other units that have the vast majority of the people that carry a mental illness diagnosis mental health units too. Would that work? Would that fit? Probably not. Okay, get off my soapbox. Okay, so we have 3 specialized units. In a nutshell, here is what the purpose of those units are. Those units supply a higher staff to youth ratio for the purpose of building caring and supportive relationships. So maintaining safety, building caring and supportive relationships. Okay, the kids that get placed in the specialized living units, either on paper or on paper, meaning that we're getting them after blowing out of very specialized programs in the community. So they're blowing out of like a children's farm home, they're blowing out of a DD group home, right? They're blowing out of boutique treatment programs where parents send them away for weeks to go get fixed, and then that doesn't work. Okay, that can kind of be a hallmark indicator of a Rockaway kid, okay, or a courtyard kid. Sorry. So you have that combined with their adjustment period coming through intake. So coming through Maple or Noble, sometimes Summit, but mostly Maple and Noble. So that adjustment period to group living correctional life at Maple or Noble probably carries more weight for me than anything else. Okay? So what is their capacity for developing relationships with the staff, and how well do they get along with their peers? Right? Those are probably the 2 most driving factors for kids that wind up in the specialized units, above and beyond anything else. Okay? So above and beyond anything that comes with them from the community in terms of reports, assessments, opinions. Okay? Above what psychologicals say or don't say. Okay? Above what a judge may say or not. Really looking at their ability to adjust to group living correctional environments. Okay? Remember, I've got 48 beds, right? I think that's 16 times 3. And actually not all of those beds are full. Okay, we'll talk about that later as well. Okay, so I got 48 beds. So how do I make that determination? Okay, so I try to, on a weekly basis, look at the rosters at our intake units, and then I'll go to incident reports, and I will sort by youth name, and I'm looking for the kids that are generating the most YARs, right? That's a behavior-based indicator of how they are adjusting to the group living environment, okay? And also keep in mind that this is an environment where they do have individual rooms, right? So they're not having to deal with the pros and cons of an open dorm for overnight sleeping, okay? So that's a stress factor that isn't present in the intake units that kids will have to deal with if they don't go to the courtyard, because in the courtyard they all have individual rooms to sleep in at night. Okay, so that's what I do. I go to the rosters, Maple and Noble. I look at the incidents for the unit. I sort by youth, and I see who is driving the majority of their problems, their YIRs, their incidents. Okay, that's probably the number one indicator of somebody who's going to be a candidate for specialized living units. Okay? Because keep in mind, by and large, the intake units maintain a similar staffing ratio that the specialized units do, for the most part, not always. And so it's an indicator that in that environment where they have lower numbers of youth and higher numbers of staff, you're still generating YARs. That means something's getting in the way of you connecting in a meaningful way with staff and peers, right? And it's that something that sometimes can be explained by a mental health diagnosis. Sometimes it can be explained by a trauma history. Sometimes it can be explained by a developmental delay. Sometimes it can be explained by a medical syndrome, right? What's a medical syndrome? Fetal alcohol syndrome might be something that explains what's getting in the way of that kid from attaching and belonging, which are the sub phrases for caring and supportive relationships. Okay, learning and doing, attaching and belonging. Those are concepts that are embedded within our PhD culture. So once I see, okay, Johnny Smith on Noble, in a month he's produced 17 YARs, right? Well, then I'm going to start looking through those narratives on those YARs. And this is what I'm looking for. It was time to transition to bedtime, and youth refused to go into his room. I gave the youth 3 directives. The youth refused, stated there is no way he was going to his room. So I called a Green 2, right? Green 2 and MacLaren's our code for assistance. I'll cut to the chase. This kid gets taken down, put in a blanket, go to isolation, and all over a refusal to go into his room at night. That might be an indicator of active trauma. And that kid may or may not have a diagnosis of trauma or PTSD. That's why I'm saying I don't necessarily care what the previous or current psychological reports are indicating, right? Behavior is going to be the primary driver for me in making a determination of what kid goes into the courtyard versus what kid goes elsewhere. Okay? That's just one example. But basically what I'm looking for is kids that are showing a pattern of not being able to go along with basic correctional group living expectations. And not from just a defiance, you're not going to make any type of a deal, right? But from a, hey, this was kind of a simple request, and then the response that we got was like way huge, right? That's a good indicator of something else that's going on. And I try to talk to the kid, but he's not listening. He doesn't seem to be understanding what I'm saying. Multiple staff have tried, and there's just kind of this wall, right? There's this blockage that's in there that's preventing the kid from connecting in a meaningful way to staff and peers. Sometimes peer mentors. Those living units have live-in mentors that are very useful with making that connection as well. Okay. Sometimes we get kids in intake that really are experiencing active psychosis, so they're kind of an easy pick to go somewhere in the courtyard. Okay. But just because a kid carries a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean that they're automatically going to go to a specialized unit at MacLarem. Okay, one is bed space. I may not have the bed space for them, right? And there may not be a bed available coming open in a time frame that works with the overall intake process. Then we have to make a tough decision. Do we let the kid continue to be at intake in hopes that a bed will open up sooner than later? Or do we place the young person elsewhere in our system and then really help support that placement to meet the kids' needs. Okay, it's really kind of the two options. So for you JPPOs, if I had 1,000 beds available under the umbrella of specialized living units, every kid would go there, right? It's not saying that I don't think your kid could benefit from this living unit, right? It's more of, I only have so many beds, and some kids we say yes to, and some kids we say no to. It doesn't mean that I don't think that your kid could benefit from being in there, right? If I could wave a magic wand, we would have cultures and environments that we're developing in the courtyard everywhere, right? So that way, every placement within the agency would be able to say in good faith, with good experience and good context, yes, we'll take that kid, and we're confident we'll be able to move that kid far enough along their path of progress that will allow them to move on to the next phase. Okay, that's my ultimate vision for the entire system, is that when that decision gets made, youth Timmy Smith is going to unit whatever, that the team, the culture, the staff and the youth say, absolutely bring them, and we're going to do everything we can to move that kid down the path of progress. And that's my ultimate vision. So how do I make that tough choice between a kid that gets a bed versus a kid that doesn't? Okay, so let's talk about other kind of telltale signs of a courtyard kid. Oftentimes, okay, so they'll probably have multiple foster care placements. They will have multiple unsuccessful placements at a variety of residential treatment providers. Okay, those are usually two initial indicators. A lot of the time, their crime of commitment will be against a care provider in some way. So it's either against their own family. So you have the harassment charge or the assault for. Sometimes it'll be against a caregiver in a group home, in a foster home, or at a residential treatment center, right? And so these are kids that have been taken out of homes and placed elsewhere, and in the process of being there, they wind up getting physical with the caregivers there, and then that will result in like I said, an assault for or harassment charge. Okay, sometimes these kids don't have a person-to-person crime at all that's their crime of commitment. Okay, so when you see a kid that's generating YARs, and then you look and see that their initial crime wasn't even a person-to-person crime, to me that's an automatic red lights flashing. Okay, because those are kids that again, if they were able to function better, right, they'd be able to listen to what the system is telling them and listen to what their PO is telling them, right? And a kid with a crime like a harassment or an assault for probably are being told this: look, you're going to go to OIA correction side, you're going to go to MacLarem, and you're going to be expected to go to school and get some skill building done, do some treatment as the assessments are indicating, and within 4 to 6 months we'll see if you've made enough progress, and we'll look at getting you out of there. Okay, your average corrections skilled kid with like an assault for or harassment charge is going to be able to hear that, understand it, and get to work and move on. Okay, your specialized unit kid isn't going to be able to hear any of that at all, right? So they come in with these, again, non-person to person crimes, then they wind up staying with us because they're generating more of these assaultive behaviors while they're with us, especially in our old kind of environments that we're moving away from. Okay, the reduction in isolation is benefiting these types of kids tremendously. So then we'll talk about well, let's stay more on some telltale signs of a Rockaway or a specialized unit kid, right? So they tend to be younger in age, although we do have the Pacific unit that is, for 17 and over. Tend to be younger in age, lots of failed placements, including foster care. Oftentimes they will have a crime against their caregivers, or a non-person-to-person crime in the first place. Let's see what else are telltale signs. These are kids, and this really comes from the Rockaway ULT, having almost 4 years under their belt of doing that type of work. These are kids that when you debrief with them after an incident, they do express remorse. They express concern for others, and they genuinely can present as scared of their own behavior and the impact that they had on other people, right? Versus other types of kids that will put forth a different kind of response to that, like they will glorify the aggressive behavior, right? Because they're in that might makes right type of moral development phase, and they'll talk about doing it again and how they don't care if they hurt peers and staff, and that's kind of a different presentation than your typical specialized unit kid. Okay, so that's another thing that we learned through Rockaway ULT doing a reach-ins with potential candidates to that are on intake. What else do I look at their risk overview screen in JGIS, right? So this is some nuts and bolts assessment data that we have, right? So I'll look at, again, these are typically kids that in the risk overview screen, they will have a higher percentage of success rate at the county or community over facility, yet they're in the facility. Okay, and that's always a telltale sign. You look at Onira scores, right? They're going to be higher. Okay, they're going to be typology A or F kids, and more A than F, in my opinion. And I have some reasons for that, and I won't go into it in this video. But overall, I don't agree with how the explanation and training rolled out about typology, is particularly around the A and Fs. But that's me. That's my kind of, at the beginning of the video, should have given my caveat that I'm not speaking on behalf of the agency. I'm speaking on my own behalf and my own experience, and that you will find other people in the agency that will have different opinions and different takes on the information I present. Okay, caveat done. So all of those telltale signs, right? But here's really what it comes down to. If that youth does not get a bed in a specialized unit, what is the likelihood that they will wind up in Department of Corrections via a trail of blood, sweat, and tears because we put them in an environment with a known deficiency to connect well with staff and peers, and then that becomes the driver of aggressive behavior in our system? Okay? To me, that's the bottom line. I'll say it again. If this youth doesn't get a bed in a specialized living unit, what is the likelihood that they will wind up in Department of Corrections via a path of blood, sweat, and tears stemming from aggressive behavior because we put them in a living environment where there's less staff and more youth, and the kid already has a pronounced deficit in his ability to connect and develop caring and supportive relationships with staff and peers? Okay? To me, that's the bottom line. I don't know. Well, that is one of the symptoms of all mental illness, right, is that it complicates your relationships with other people. It's one of the social factors of having a mental illness, right? But again, 600 kids in our system, roughly, right? 800, 80% of them carry a major mental illness diagnosis. So roughly 600 kids in our system. I only got 48 beds, sort of. Okay, so just because, so you might have a kid that carries, all kinds of mental health diagnoses at intake, or might have PTSD at intake, right? But if they're being assessed as being able to make connections with staff and peers, caring and supportive relationships, then they are more likely to be successful in a standard living unit. Okay, and that's really what it comes down to for me. If this kid does not get a bed in a specialized living unit, what is the chances, what's the likelihood that they'll wind up in DOC? Okay, because frankly, this is 20 years that I have doing this work for the agency, and some of the most notorious kids that we've sent to DOC came to us little pipsqueaks that just couldn't connect well with staff and peers, and they turned aggressive. And that was really kind of the genesis of the Rockaway living unit, was that we know this. We can predict at any given time we have 10 to 15 kids that fit that description, that if we don't do something different with them, then they will become the next infamous OYA case that winds up going to Department of Corrections. Okay, so that was really kind of the group of us got together and said, how do we shut the faucet off on that? And for the most part we did it. And I can tell you that we did it is because I don't have anybody holed up in IU right now, right? I don't have anybody who is assaulting my staff on a daily basis, predictable shift by shift basis in IU right now. We haven't had that for the better part of 2 years. And I can attribute a lot of that to the approach that we're taking at intake itself and at the specialized living units. So we have, as an agency, and through the hard work of all those teams that are attached to those living units, shut the faucet off on creating those kids. Now, does that mean that we'll never send a kid to DOC? No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that we are doing something significantly better with those kids that come in with pronounced skill deficits in terms of connecting well with people, and we're digging in and doing the hard work with them, and we're seeing a different outcome and different result. Okay, so I'll come back and do some more videos on this topic, but I wanted to get this first one out there to just talk about what are the specialized living units at MacLarem. I didn't talk about programming there in this video, but I can save that for another video. So there it is. There's kind of my raw take on what lands a kid in a specialized living unit versus when they get placed elsewhere. And like I said, I'm going to pull together a group of people to kind of map this process out, so that way other people can sink into it and hopefully grasp the same understanding of what makes a specialized unit kid versus what kids do we send elsewhere with the idea that they should be able to be successful in those standard living unit environments. So hopefully that provided some help and value to your understanding of specialized units at MacLarem. If it did, or if you have questions, make sure to put that in a comment. All right, take care. And this has been just under 30 minutes. All right, see you next time.